Iran is finished. Iran's status as a regional power is gone. It has been reduced to a shell of its former self. And if I told you back in 2022 that the entire Iranian Ring of Fire doctrine, which was supposed to encircle the Israelis with multiple proxies, is going to be decapitated, collapsed, and irrelevant, also rendering Iran irrelevant in the neighborhood, taking out completely of the geopolitical game in the Middle East and in the Gulf, you would have thought I'd be crazy, because how could that be? Because everything was going well for the Iranians. Now, what am I talking about here? Well, here's the thing. If you look at the Iranian doctrine of Ring of Fire, the idea was very simple, right? Let's create a bunch of proxies around the Israeli borders. Let's have a few in the north, which is Hezbollah and Syria. Let's have one inside, which is Hamas and the PIJ. And let's have one in Iraq and in Yemen to provide a little bit more of a long-term threat. And let's have all of these guys create the scenario where the Israelis are non-stop engaged in these little wars that are multi-front and are not directly a threat to the Israeli existence, but yet very demoralizing, very lengthy, and will also deter the Israelis from doing what Iran does not want. Now, the one thing Iran, and when I say Iran, I mean the Iranian regime, did not want is a direct confrontation with the Israelis. That was never the plan. In fact, this was the one thing Iran has never wanted, and it tried to prevent actively. The whole creation of the Ring of Fire doctrine, and when I say Ring of Fire, I mean this, right? This Ring of Fire, this Ring of Fire. The whole idea was to create an encirclement around the Israelis and to prevent the one thing Iran is afraid of, which is a direct confrontation with the Israelis. As much as Iran spent decades and billions of dollars in building up proxies and building up their own missile capabilities, they really haven't spent any money on modernizing their military, partially because it's sanctions, partially because they prioritize this other thing. But the fact remains that the Iranian actual military is no match for the Israelis in a direct confrontation. And you've seen it play out in the 12-day war when the Israelis almost instantaneously achieved complete air dominance and were essentially walking through the Iranian airspace like it was a boardwalk, right? It's not a good military. It's not modern. It is underfunded, and it is absolutely a joke. So what the Iranians were trying to do is to hide that weakness by creating a deterrence, right? If we have all these proxies around the Israelis, then the Israelis are not going to want to hit us directly, because if they do, Hezbollah is going to wreak havoc on the Israeli northern parts, right? And then Hamas can do stuff, and then et cetera, et cetera. But even if the Israelis leave us alone, right, we're still going to be activating these proxies to constantly apply non-stop pressure on the Israelis, to constantly have them engaged in a multi-front war so that we can demoralize and weaken the Israelis year after year after year. So when that actual collapse happens, we have made it happen from inside or from the outside, or maybe if there is a direct confrontation sometime down the road in decades, we have absolutely kind of defanged the Israelis. That was the whole plan. And actually, up until October 7th, that plan was being executed to perfection. The Israelis were playing right into the hands of Iran by engaging in multi-front little wars against these proxies, mainly Hezbollah and mainly the Hamas, not so much the Houthi rebels or the Iraqi militia, not even Syria that much, but nevertheless. On October 7th, right, Hezbollah, whether by an independent decision, which I don't believe to be the case, or as a way of Iran to try and help Hamas to survive, got involved with the Israelis. So as October 7th folded, and as the Israelis started to engage in a war against Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah started actively bombing the northern Israel. And doing so was designed to withdraw some forces from Gaza, from the Israelis, have them be allocated to the northern part, deal with Hezbollah, and essentially allow Hamas some breathing room to narrowly survive this thing. While the whole point was not to get involved in the full-on confrontation between Hezbollah and the Israelis, so that Hezbollah remains a leverage from the north to prevent the Israelis from ever thinking about striking Iran. If you ever strike us, Hezbollah is going to be a retaliation, so you don't want to do that, right? But here's where the plan fell apart, because that triggered something that the Israelis were not actually trying to get done. There was no political route for the Israelis to take out Hezbollah. The threat of what the consequence would be in a direct engaged warfare versus Hezbollah essentially paralyzed the Israelis for years and years and years, ever since they withdrew from Lebanon a couple decades ago. And Hezbollah was basically running free in southern Lebanon, doing whatever they want, because they knew that the Israelis are not interested in confrontation. But what happened is, because the Gaza thing essentially evolved into a full-on war, the Israelis finally had enough, and they essentially decapitated the entire leadership and mostly, took out thousands of Hezbollah leaders in a day, bombed the hell out of them, and essentially wiped out Hezbollah pretty quickly and pretty effectively and almost with no casualties. So basically the Israelis were forced to deal with Hezbollah, which is something they didn't want to do, but once they did, they found out it wasn't as scary as advertised. They quickly dispatched of thousands of Hezbollah leaders, soldiers. They took out the infrastructure. They essentially made them irrelevant. And that cascaded into the fall of the Assad regime, because the main enforcer that was keeping Assad alive was the Hezbollah forces. But once the Israelis dispatched them, the foundations of what was keeping the Assad regime alive fell apart. So Hezbollah and the Assad regime essentially got decapitated at the same time. Now, on the other hand, you had Hamas, which was a very unlikely collaborator or proxy for Iran, simply because they're Sunni. But nevertheless, because of the common hatred for the Israelis, it was a partnership of convenience, even though both sides really didn't like each other. But at this point, Hamas, as you're seeing on the ground, is kind of still able to carry out guerrilla attacks and cause pain for the Israeli military in Gaza, but they've lost any strategic capability to inflict actual strategic damage on the Israelis. At this point, it has been reduced to a guerrilla random organization. It has no central command. It is absolutely a shell of its former self. So yes, they can, they can put an IED and blow up a tank or blow up a Humvee, but strategically speaking, Hamas is basically gone. It's no longer there. Now, with the central command of Hamas gone, with the Assad regime gone, as a consequence of what happened with Hezbollah, right? And now, with the whole thing, with the Houthis essentially being mostly decapitated or limited by the Israelis, so what Iran has left is this diminished version of the Houthis, right? And they've got the Iraqi Shiite militias, but again, this is a very, very limited impact on the Israeli borders. It's just too far, and they lack the skill set, capabilities, and the weaponry. Now, on the other hand, the Houthi regime, they've got a lot of missiles, they've got a lot of tech, but again, their distance and their inability to saturate the Israeli air defense basically have brought them down to a level of an alarm clock. So every couple of days, the Israelis have an alarm clock. They hear that the Houthi missile is coming, their aero system shoots it down. It's pretty straightforward. It's just nothing but a nuisance. So Iran is left with a nuisance, which is the Houthi rebels. They're slowly losing their infrastructure as well, because the Israelis have been effectively dismantling their entire port system, the power provision system. So basically they're getting hammered, but they're not really doing any damage. And now we come to this point, right? So we've got the whole Lebanon situation unfolding right now, right in front of us, but note who's not there, right? Over the past few days, I don't know if you guys heard, even over the past few weeks, even over the past few months, there's a huge debate in Lebanon about the disarming of Hezbollah. Local Lebanese politicians and leaders are saying, well, look, folks, we have a military, we have a police force. You want to be a political organization? go ahead, be a political organization. There's no need for a paramilitary organization that's on top of the existing Lebanese military. We don't need you anymore. There is no Israeli invasion to Lebanon that you're supposed to protect us from. We have a military, and plus the Israelis are not invading to Lebanon. And of course, Hezbollah is saying, no, we're not going to disarm. And there's this whole debate, right? And right now, what we have is something that would have never happened if Iran still had clout in Lebanon, if Iran still had clout in Syria, if they could still actually help Hezbollah. But because the Iranian regime has lost all leverage in Lebanon, the Lebanese are slowly pushing out Hezbollah back into being a little political organization. We have an absolute force in Lebanon that we haven't seen in decades. We have the Lebanese people essentially saying, look, we don't like the Israelis, right? But you guys, why the hell do you have a military? Like, what's the point? I mean, we don't want that. And they're pushing out these guys. And of course, the Shiite community, sectorial-wise, are not going to be happy about it, but there's nothing they can do, right? Because the whole idea of Hezbollah was always we're resistant movements against the Israelis, but the Israelis are gone. They've been gone for 20 years. And now it's been exposed. And they're saying, well, look, what happened in Gaza, we don't want it to happen in Lebanon because you guys have started some shit with the Israelis. So just put down your weapons and let the Israelis do their thing and just forget, we're not part of this war. We're not, why are we fighting for Gaza, right? On top of this, you have the Iranian post-war internal crisis, while the PR effort from Iran was not bad. But what happened eventually is that in the blow exchange between the Israelis and the Iranian regime, what happened is something very interesting. While the Iranian regime was able to kill a lot of civilians and hit a lot of residential buildings, they've also been very limited in holding some infrastructure, but nothing critical, right? The Israelis have managed to take out the entire Iranian leadership, to take out the air force, to take out the air defense systems, and with the help of the United States, also take out or at least diminish greatly the capacity for a new nuclear plant from Iran. So you have this very interesting thing right now when Iran is essentially going itself through some sort of a reform system, because as the previous regime screwed up and the whole stuff that happened with the Israelis essentially weakened them a lot, what you have right now is reformist forces inside Iran talking about potentially a change. We need to change. Of course, they're not talking about making peace with the Israelis. They're not talking about making peace with the US, but the more pragmatic forces in Iran are actually starting to create some sort of an opposition to the existing regime. What we have right now is a lot of chatter in Iran that you're not going to hear about in mainstream media, but a lot of mess right now in Iran. We have accusations of treason. A lot of people are being called as Western agents because they're calling for the change or a more pragmatic regime. But the thing is, right, until that regime actually takes a hit to a point where it's unable to stop this from happening and it becomes more than just conversations, they're still holding on, okay? It's not going to happen tomorrow. I don't think the regime collapses tomorrow. They still have the power. They still have all the means of power, right? But here are my three scenarios for what happens next in Iran. I think that scenario number one, where we have stalemate with rising pressure, right? We'll have Hezbollah essentially remaining with some sort of a military capacity, right? We have the Lebanese army pretending as if they took over most of Hezbollah, but they kind of declare a truce. And we have essentially Iran staying with the current configuration of the regime, but a very diminished capacity, no regional impact. And essentially we have this stalemate where everybody's pissed off, but nobody's doing jack shit yet. Now the second scenario is basically when the Iranian regime essentially is unable to kind of push back the internal stuff they've got going on, and they're going to need kind of a rally behind the flag moment. They might escalate against the Israelis to squash internal unrest back in Iran. Of course, that option always has the risk to spiral into an absolute shit festival and a regional war that nobody wants to see, okay? Number three, which is a very unlikely scenario in my opinion, but hey, who knows, right? The reformists inside Iran actually break through, they consolidate, they push the IRGC out, and this basically kills Hezbollah, whatever's left of it. Lebanon becomes a complete US-dominated geography. Turkey owns Syria, which by extension is also US-influenced. Egypt is already. The elimination of the Houthis becomes a matter of time at this point. The entire ring of fire dies and the Iranian regime goes away. Essentially self-inflicted by reformers from the inside. I would put this at a very unlikely scenario, okay? But again, we can only hope. Now, as far as the US implications, we got to make sure we understand what's happening, right? If Hezbollah is pushed against the wall and they're faced with this demands to disarm, where they don't intend to disarm, we might see a potential conflict inside Lebanon, potentially Hezbollah starting something with the Israelis to drag them in so that they can show why weapons are needed. So I think it's important on the US side to make sure Lebanon's own government and military is strong enough to handle this and to try and push forward as much as possible the reformist forces in Iran. Okay, now what I think is important to understand here is that what's going on right now in Lebanon as far as the Hezbollah demands to disarm is absolutely inseparable from what's going on in Iran. If Iran had more clout, if Iran had more strength, if they had more influence, this would have never been a thing. The only reason it's happening, the only reason we have reformists talking even in Iran instead of being in a jail cell, right? Or in the firing squad, is because the regime is losing power. And that's important to understand. You're never going to have a direct announcement saying, oh, the Iranian regime is losing power. Mainstream media is not going to tell you this because they're too lazy and they just read the news instead of analyzing, okay? I think it's important for the US here to do two things. Number one, support Lebanese sovereignty, which is super important to push out Hezbollah and diminish Iran's influence even more, and exploit what's going on inside Iran to try and weaken as much as possible the existing regime and potentially put somebody in power who's a little bit more pragmatic, okay? We'll see over the next year where this thing is headed. Nothing will shock me in this region, but this is my analysis. A little bit better than what you get in Mr. Media, of course. But if you are interested in more of these videos, comment below. Let me know what you want to hear more about, what kind of analysis you want to get more of. Of course, hit the like button, subscribe, all that good stuff. I'll see you next one. Peace.